It's a little bit slow getting the YouTube live streaming going. And it's going to look to you guys like it's live, but it looks like it's live.
Awesome. Welcome, everybody. My name's Autumn Keynes. Welcome to a virtually connecting missed conversation around OER domains 21, as well as some of the dangers of remote proctoring. I'm just going to jump right into introductions. We're going to start with our hosts and then our keynote guests and then the discussants that we've pulled in. We'll start with Mahab Ali.
Hi, I'm Mahab Ali from the American University in Cairo, and I'm also the co-director of Virtually Connecting. Go Brenna.
Hi, my name is Brenna Clark-Gray. I'm coordinator of educational technologies at Thompson Rivers University. I'm also going to be watching our YouTube chat today, and I just wanted to say, if you're a student, please self-identify yourself when you ask questions on the YouTube chat. That way we can prioritize your questions.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jasmine Roberts. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm a professor at the Ohio State University in the U.S.
Hello, everybody. I'm Tudaleni Asino, and I'm at Oklahoma State University.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rajiv Jangiani. I'm the Associate Vice President for Teaching and Learning at Kwantlen Polytechnic University in British Columbia. Really glad to be here.
My name is Laura Gibbs. I teach online for the University of Oklahoma. So Oklahoma very well represented here today. Me and Tudaleni.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maya Hay. I'm a PhD candidate at Concordia University and the writer in residence at Pressbooks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Silverman, she, her pronouns, and I'm an instructional designer at University of Michigan, Dearborn.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Sorry. Oh, I thought it was Erki. Sorry.
Okay, it is you. Go, go.
Right.
Oh, great. Sorry, I can't share my camera right now, but I will in a short while. I'm Erki Haipinge. I'm a lecturer of educational technology, but also in the e-learning sector at my university, and I'm from Namibia. I'm really glad to join this conversation.
Sorry about that. Hi, everybody. My name is Georgia. I am currently a student in my fourth year in biology at the University of British Columbia, and I am also the outgoing AMS Vice President of Academic and University Affairs.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone, to this very special edition of Virtually Connecting. My name is Autumn Keynes. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an instructional designer at the University of Michigan, Dearborn with Sarah. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about it's been a long time since we've had a Virtually Connecting session. Once the pandemic hit, we kind of had some spatterings of them. It was our movement was really based in bringing folks who couldn't come to conferences to physical conferences virtually for hallway conversations. And when all conferences are online, all of a sudden, there was just plus, I mean, it's a pandemic, right? We're very busy. There's lots of stuff going on. So we don't normally do topics. Usually we do personalities. We bring people together to just talk to one another that we think are interesting. We try to get people who were involved in the conference, keynote speakers, that kind of thing, and then folks who can't make it to the conference. But this particular time, it did seem like there was something very pressing with this remote proctoring conversation going on more broadly. So we thought it would be interesting to maybe take that on as a topic. We do occasionally do these missed conversations after the conference. So we said we can still keep doing those. Let's do one of those around this. And then days before we were supposed to go through this, some news broke that Ian Linkletter, who's being sued by Proctorio, was seeing some new movement on the court case and was also incurring some new costs along with that. He did a fundraiser with a lot of folks, but Brenna, I should really say, was she put that together, made that. Thank you, Brenna, for that. And raised about $50,000 in doing that. But he just announced that, he's already at $100,000 and there's potentially more court costs to be incurred. So at the last minute, I kind of told all these people, hey, there's this thing that we want to make it a part of this. So not everybody here is an expert on the intricacies of that lawsuit and about what's going on with that, but they are here to discuss with us and to talk about it. And we do have a 1-minute video from Ian that I'd like to play now if I can. I'm going to ask everybody, including myself, to please shut off and mute your cameras. And then I will go ahead and share my screen and then play the video. So just give me 1 moment to get that set up, and I got to make sure that my sound is set up in my video clip and that I choose the right window. And then, all right, I'm going to play the video now.
Autumn, Brenna, Georgia, Laura, Maha, Rajiv, and Sarah. I've had open-hearted conversation with all of you about the harms of academic surveillance in Proctorio's lawsuit against me. You've helped me and taught me more than I can say and more than I can ever thank you for. And thank you everyone so much for coming here today and helping raise funds for my legal defense. Justice is coming, but perhaps not as soon as we thought. Just 1 week away from the hearing to dismiss Proctorio's lawsuit, I'm counting up again. It's now day 233 of this lawsuit and the improper injunction restricting my speech and expression. But I know I can count on you to keep this conversation going, even though Proctorio tried to stop us. I'm with you in solidarity against surveillance, and one day the injunction will be dissolved and I'll be with you here, live. Thank you all for your support, and stay tuned next week for what happens in court.
Okay, we can turn our videos back on and come back into this. And with that, in virtually connecting satellite spirit, I will kind of open things up for a little more conversation around this. Rajiv, I think that maybe you could frame this a little bit for us. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. I know been certainly following this case for a while, but even before Ian's case really emerged, I think, so the University of British Columbia was one of the many universities that in the wake of the pivot to remote instruction, tried to find ways to support their faculty. And in this particular case, it was, I think faculty were really interested in persisting with a particular approach to assessments by doing what I imagine at the time that they thought was appropriate, but which in fact since then, about a month ago, their own Senate has decided is no longer appropriate, which is supplying the use of remote invigilation tools. Ian is a learning technology specialist at the Faculty of Education at UBC, and last September he was sued by the very same remote proctoring company that UBC had contracted, Proctorio. Among the things that Proctorio alleged, and I'm quoting over here from the claim, is that Linkletter had repeatedly caused the plaintiff's copyrighted, confidential, and proprietary information to be disseminated online inter alia via Twitter, end quote. But if you look into the details, what he really did was he tweeted to share 7 videos that provide a walkthrough of different features of the software, such as a room scanning feature, which according to an article in the UBC allows university employees to click and drag through a panorama of a student's personal home, for example. And these videos, to be clear, were not stolen from the company's servers. They were uploaded to YouTube by Proctorio itself as unlisted videos. And so that's a bit of the context. A couple of other things I'll mention quickly, which is that, there's a bit of a history over here. I think Ian was one of the many people who were helping to have a bit more of a conversation, as I think the decisions to go with software like this took place ahead of any sort of wide academic, thoughtful conversation about whether it's ethical and pedagogical dimensions. And so Ian was helping to contribute to that conversation. Part of it was noticing that even when students were complaining, for example, there was a student at UBC again who wrote on Reddit complaining about Proctorio customer support. The CEO of Proctorio chimed in, sharing screenshots of the students' chat logs on the same Reddit thread. Now, although the company later apologized for that behavior, I will note that Ian tweeted about that Reddit case just 6 days before he was sued. So I know he is disallowed from talking about a lot of this. It's going to be in court in British Columbia and the Supreme Court on April 28th and 29th. But certainly it's catalyzed a wider conversation. And I would certainly guess that it is one of the factors that not just UBC has led UBC to step away from remote proctoring, but many other institutions as well. So.
And I think I was going to go next and say a bit about how I met Ian and started working with him. And it's almost exactly 2 years ago. And so this is going to be a little bit of a long story, but it's an important one, and it's connected actually to the theme of my keynote at the conference. So it sort of ties in with our virtually connecting here. The theme of my keynote was Beyond LMS, and doing our teaching and learning outside of the LMS using the internet, working online, but not using the LMS as our central tool. And my school uses Canvas, and I had been a big Canvas booster when we switched to Canvas, because one of the things that Canvas has that the other LMSs don't is the way that you can use a Canvas course almost like a website. It can become actually something that's open on the internet that you can link to and share, and it's not closed and shut off on purpose the way other LMS courses are. Canvas courses are usually closed by default, but you can open them up. And so since they can be open, I really threw myself into the Canvas community and was a big Canvas booster, because of this option, the idea that, the LMS doesn't have to be closed. And here's an example of how it can be open. And as a participant in the Canvas community, I posted hundreds of blog posts and was very actively involved in all kinds of faculty development and helping people find solutions to create sort of windows, the way that you can have websites on the internet, but have them display inside the LMS if that's more convenient for your students and so on. And so that was all going swimmingly. But then Instructure, the company that produces Canvas, got a new CEO, Dan Goldsmith. And he came in with no background of any kind in education. He was an engineer. And he came in and decided that Instructure's new future was going to be in AI and machine learning. And that since they had been, unlike the other LMSs, in the cloud from the start, Instructure didn't switch to the cloud as the other LMSs had to do. It was conceived in the cloud, started on the cloud originally. They were sitting on mountains of student data, mountains and mountains of student data across all kinds of institutions. And so Dan Goldsmith saw that this was big data and decided that the future of Instructure was going to be to monetize that data in some way. They were going to build new predictive products using all of that data, and this was going to be profitable for the company. And since they had just gone public recently as a company, the way we found out about this 2 years ago was in a meeting with shareholders for the company. And Phil Hill, whom some of you I'm sure know, reported on this. And I can remember even now sitting here reading these statements by Dan Goldsmith about what they were going to do with students' data at Instructure and how they were going to use it to predict a student's performance in a class even before the student set foot in the classroom. That's what they were going to be able to do. And I realized that was my students' data in there that was being used for this purpose, to which I certainly would never give consent as a teacher, and my students had never given consent to as students. And it was a fait accompli. These products were already in development. It had happened. And so I went to the Canvas community and I posted a post just filled with really rage, there's no other word for it, about what was going on and what were we going to do about this as a community, since it's the Canvas community, right? And I was told to leave the community at that point because I had violated the community terms, which is that everything you should post has to be upbeat and positive. And if I couldn't be upbeat and positive, I should leave. I could post anything I wanted. They weren't censoring me, but it had to be upbeat and positive because that's how the community works. And so that's when I stopped blogging at the Canvas community and started blogging in my own blog, and blogging mostly about what I started to learn about data and surveillance, because I was so naive. I I knew the data went somewhere. I didn't really know where it went or what it was used for. And that's how I hooked up with Ian. I started blogging about my concerns about this, and Ian had the same concerns. And the two of us both started blogging at great length about Instructure and what was going on, and organizing a community of faculty who were concerned about this. And I won't go into all the details. We made some progress. But then Instructure went private again. They're no longer a publicly traded company. There are no more meetings with shareholders. So they have a new CEO, and we don't know what he's doing because he's not having quarterly meetings with shareholders. And I guess I wanted to end with a conversation I had with my husband yesterday, which is that I told him about the latest that was going on with Ian and how upsetting and wrong this all is. And he looked at me and he said, well, have you done anything that Instructure is going to sue you for? And that was really chilling to me, because of course I want to say, no, Instructure is not going to sue me. But I think what Proctorio is trying to do here, maybe others see it differently, is to intimidate and silence people, to make you realize that where would you come up with $100,000, and who could you turn to help? And is your institution going to stand behind you? Well, maybe it's just easier to not say anything. So I almost cried listening to Ian's video. What he's gone through is appalling, and it could have been any one of us. And I really hope that we can find ways to help Ian practically, politically, spiritually, publicly, privately, whatever, because he's someone I really admire, and what's happened to him, I think, is incredibly wrong and dangerous for the whole educational enterprise. So long story, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, I think that is such a meaningful story that you've told, Laura. And I'd also really like to speak about how meaningful Ian's work has been to the student community, and how it's also shown such a care for students, especially as, students and the whole traumatic switch to online learning for a lot of students last March. And I mean, it was a traumatic switch for everybody, educators and students, all of that. And I think that, that's where we saw the whole uptick in a lot of this surveillance software. And, students complained on social media, on Reddit. I was seeing like a lot of different posts on Twitter or Reddit or Facebook, or in like group chats that were like worried about Proctorio, or like, Proctorio and like Respondus lockdown browser is really shady, or like I feel really invaded. And so there were just those kind of quiet whisperings at first, but then there was the whole Reddit blow up, I guess, around the Proctorio CEO posting those chat logs, and then it really exploded. And then I think a lot of students are really like here to support Ian as well, and to show that that he's done such great work uncovering it. I think a lot of the approach from administrations around the university has been, students don't really understand the technology, it's a lot of the behind the scenes work. But I think Ian has really helped shed a light on how really ethically shady this software is. And really, if students are expected to learn about how to navigate a society ethically, and in a compassionate way, we're not demonstrating that through Proctorio as well. So I think that Ian's work has been so incredibly meaningful to the student community. And I think that for educators out there who might be leaning towards using surveillance software like Proctorio, Respondus, or Respondus Monitor, I think that one of the ways that we can really reach out to students who are going through significant mental health challenges, that are going through a lot of feelings of being disconnected. I think one of the best ways we can do that is by eliminating remote proctoring software as well.
Thank you so much for that, Georgia. You made, I think, a lot of the arguments against proctoring software. And one of the things that you brought up that people rarely bring up is what it means to US students to become ethical citizens, and how Proctorio is so against that. It's like the opposite of that. And some of the things you're talking about is the ways in which, first of all, you know, the impact on students who are already going through trauma, then also making that citizenship connection. It's normalizing surveillance, things like facial recognition, the use of AI to normalize ways of behaving and your body and how your body behaves in front of the camera. And it also criminalizes you before you even take the exam, right? Like you're being surveilled and because you're expected to cheat, and it's supposed to stop you from doing that. And I was just talking earlier about how the film Coded Bias focuses on the use of facial recognition and AI in the criminal justice system in the US and the UK and different countries. But this is sort of like normalizing it in college so that when you graduate, you're used to being surveilled in that way, and you're used to being to these systems that are already biased against you. And you're supposed to accept it. And I think it's criminal that institutions want students to accept that kind of technology being used on them, and then blames them for like not understanding. And then someone like Ian, who's trying to fight for the rights of students, getting sued, and then the institution not supporting them, that's just another sort of crime that higher education is doing. So.
If I can quickly jump in, I want to piggyback on that, Maha, by saying that I did not know all of what was happening with Ian and Proctorio, but what I can say is that one of my first jobs that I was able to do as an international student in this country was as an exam invigilator, like as a person invigilating exams. And I remember being trained for that, and the whole process was definitely less than human. So even before the digital surveillance, right, it was already, the idea of exam invigilation was already set up as presuming that the student is guilty and needs to prove their innocence, right, by being under this sort of controlled environment, right? And it really made me think, you know, this was of course years ago, pre-pandemic, but certainly the seeds have already been laid out, right, to set up for these very controlled, coerced systems where it's really difficult to point out some problematic things. It's very difficult to demand transparency, right? As Laura was speaking about, it's very difficult to point out these inconsistencies and have a dialogue. And I'm also thinking too about what exactly are exams assessing that require that kind of knowledge on the spot of like total recall? Because, okay, if the goal is total recall of facts, that's one thing. But I thought, and I would hope that the goal of education is more about how to learn, how to ask questions, how to collaborate with others, asking the hows and the whys. And certainly there's no incentive to design these kinds of assessments that test for that. And that's, I think, a different offshoot that this current Proctorio and Ian and the question of surveillance is really kind of trying to, it really kind of explodes in these different other avenues of what education could be if we are going to continue being an ethical ecology of learning.
I love what you said, Maya, because that's always my question to my colleagues who are still, and just to kind of give you all some context, I also don't know a lot about what's happening with Ian, but it's horrible from what I am reading. And I'm relatively new in terms of like understanding just how problematic data surveillance in general, when it comes to learning, it truly is. And, you know, when I talk to my colleagues about this, I get one of two responses, either no response or I'm too radical, right? Even just bringing up like, hey, you know, do you think this is probably the best way to assess our students? I'm finding out, given just the culture of higher ed, and not just in the West, I feel like kind of a temperature check, like a lot of higher ed institutions across the globe really need to reevaluate their culture and how they're treating their faculty, because I think in turn, faculty are desperately turning to platforms and tools that are trying to make their job more convenient as opposed to trying to make them better educators. And so when I lead with that vantage point with my colleagues, I mean, there is a bit of a defensive response sometimes. Well, I have this to do, I have that to do, I have research and this, that, and the other. And there isn't really a space or an opportunity for some of them to actually critically think about what am I exactly assessing here? And I think that has a lot to do with the structures that are before us in terms of just not really giving faculty that space, not to let some faculty off the hook, because there are some out there that, to be quite frank with you, don't care. And it's very troubling to me. But yeah, I think faculty need to think more about what are we assessing here? Because I tell my students all the time when they take my class, this is not a traditional college course where you take a couple exams, you write a term paper, and boom, that's it. It's very transactional. That's not learning, that's memorization, right? I'm more interested in who you are as an individual, who you are as a human, right? First and foremost. And what content or what concepts can support that, what skills can support who you want to be as a human, right? So Maha talked about an ethical citizen, so did you, Maya. So that's what I'm more so interested in, but I'm finding that the culture of higher ed in general around the world isn't really supporting that. So
I'm so glad you brought this up, because there are actually two ways I think we as educators can resist that. So the institutional structures that are problematic, Sarah and Autumn and a few others at their institution found ways to support faculty to do these authentic assessments, because faculty have also been traumatized in this pandemic, right? And they, who have never not given an exam, didn't know how to grade something that's not an exam, or how to create something that's not that. And to tell them, okay, don't use proctoring, but figure out a way, means a lot of labor for them. And what they figured out to do that, I want them to talk about it in a minute. The other thing that I try to do in my public scholarship is, if I'm going to give a keynote at a conference, I check who's sponsoring that keynote. And last year when OLC wanted to, I told them before I accepted to do the keynote, I would not accept a proctoring company as my sponsor. And then they made a mistake and gave me a proctoring sponsor. And then I'm like, I am not going to accept this. So they removed it. And so there are ways to do it within our institutions, to challenge the institutional structures within our institutions. And I want Sarah and Autumn to talk about that one. But there are also ways in our public scholarship, other than tweeting about it, but also resisting the other ways that are sort of less explicit, that can get sort of connecting critical scholars and then having their critical keynotes that are totally against this stuff, but giving them sponsors that go against our values, and how we can sort of resist that as well, and publicly too, I think.
Sarah, you should jump in and talk a little bit about the design aspects.
Yeah, sure. So before I get into that, I just want to note that, you know, Autumn and I and some of our colleagues at UM Dearborn did write about this. But a big part of the foundation was that we have an administration that was willing to think differently about how we use money. I think it's really important to note how much these products cost. And we're a publicly funded institution paid for, at least in part, by taxpayer dollars. And going back to something that Jasmine said, you don't really demonstrate any learning when you're taking a timed proctored exam. I think it's so important to mention that Proctorio is not even an educational technology. It doesn't facilitate learning in any way. It's not even in the bubble. And, we had a huge amount of government funding to help with pandemic relief in the United States. A lot of it came through something called the CARES Act. One of the things you were allowed to use the CARES Act funding for was technologies to facilitate distance learning, because that's what a lot of people were doing. And so many institutions turned around and used it for surveillance technology, things like remote proctoring software. And that, I just can't get over how much money has been spent on this harmful and, in my opinion, racist and ableist technology. So now for some better news about how a different path that's available, and what we were able to do at UM Dearborn, which is our administration decided to strongly recommend against any new proctoring technology, and decided to invest in more instructional design staff. So I'm a product of that. I was hired as part of this decision, and I got to work with Autumn and some of our really excellent colleagues. And what we really tried to do was help faculty rethink their assessments, instead of, like you were saying, Maha, like not just throw them over the edge and say, you can't proctor, but I don't care what else you do. I think the two main paths that we took were helping faculty to feel better about open book, open Google, open collaboration exams. You can still have something that you call a final exam, but it's going to be fundamentally different than a previous model where you're saying you can't look at anything, you can't have your book open, you can't talk to your friends. And even for those people who that was a really big stretch, they were at least able to accept there's nothing I can do to prevent it. Students can speak to each other. They can always have their books open. And what's really the worst case scenario we're trying to learn here? So that's one option. Another option is to move away from the kind of typical exam altogether and move more towards what we were drawing on literature to call authentic assessments. And so instead of having midterms and finals, asking instructors to come up with projects, reflections, case studies, all different other kinds of assessments that we have a very long history of using in all kinds of educational contexts, but that don't need or benefit from proctoring in any way. There'd be no reason to watch somebody do this kind of assignment. And in the end, it's a lot better for letting students demonstrate their knowledge in multiple ways, multiple formats that could be more beneficial for them, that are more accessible for them. And yeah, so those are kind of the two different approaches. I think it's also really important to remember while we're doing this faculty development work that people are at many, many different places in their journey towards moving towards more open practices, less surveillance practices. And what we really try to do is meet people where they are, try to help them think about what's sort of the next thing that they can be doing to move towards more open and less surveillance practices. We have some instructors that, really embrace this model completely. We have some that are still, I would say, struggling with it. But that's part of the work is to, work with everybody and provide lots of good options and lots of good support. So that's all I'll say about that for now.
I think that's great. And I just echo everything that Sarah said, and I feel really lucky to be able to work with her at an institution that has made, that decision and to be able to do that work. I've worked at other places where that wasn't the case. I've run these kind of systems, and that's part of the reason why maybe I feel so passionate about this, because I understand them, right? I've been the back end technical person who has done that, and I think that's a really important piece because the CEO of this company, Mike Olson, has said several times that he's not anti-critic. And it seems like the only critics he wants are the ones who are uninformed, the ones who don't have education, the ones who don't understand how the systems work. Because when you try to understand how the system works and you try to share that information with other people, you get sued. We have a question from YouTube from a student, and so I'll turn it over to Brenna to give us that.
So Eric Johnson has a comment, and Eric is someone with his own experiences of proctorio and their litigious nature. And if anybody wants to speak to that case, who knows it better, I would invite you to do so. But Eric has noted in the chat on YouTube that what we're really describing here is an overreach of institutional power. And it's a concept that I keep coming back to. I keep coming back to this idea of entitlement, right? We love to talk about the entitlement of students, but when did we decide that we were entitled to views of our students' home workspaces and bedrooms? Or even beyond the proctoring class, the other surveillance tools that we use, the way Microsoft Habits is willing to tell you, like, oh, your student always writes their papers at night, you should intervene on that. Like, should you? Should you have that information? Is that yours to make a judgment call about? And particularly this year, I think as people have felt out of control, there has been a tendency to impose control for some folks on the classroom, and that has had a really negative impact on students.
I wonder if I can just come in here for a second. I think to go back to that question that Brenna, that you read, I think we should probably even go back a little bit further. The purpose of giving a test is to assess whether learning has happened, right? The purpose of proctoring is to catch whether someone is cheating. So if you look at just the way that proctoring is defined, whether in any dictionary that you look at, I looked it up just quickly at the Cambridge Dictionary defines it as to watch people taking an exam in order to check that they do not cheat, right? Webster calls it an officer at a university who's responsible, especially for disciplinary measures. It has nothing to do with learning. This is about catching someone in an act that they're cheating. It is about punitive measures. So for me, that's the part where I think as educators, we need to focus more on that, not that these are not achieving the impact, or rather the whole goal of learning as a learning institution. It's not, proctoring companies are trying to catch whether a student is learning, or rather whether a student is cheating, whereas those of us who are in education are supposed to create an environment that promotes and enables learning to occur. I'm a little bit sad and ashamed that I didn't know about this case of Ian before this was raised from the email that Maha and Autumn sent. And I looked it up a little bit more, and the one article that I saw that really sort of drove this home for me is from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which calls it a SLAP lawsuit. And SLAP, as an acronym, just stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation, and is designed really just to scare somebody so that they do not speak up. And as I dug further, and this is always the problem with the internet and somebody who's a researcher, because you just keep digging further and further, is that the SLAP lawsuit has, the person who brings it doesn't care whether they win or lose. That's not the point. The point is to settle the defendant with so much debt and so much pain that they tap out and say, ouch, sorry, I'm not gonna talk bad about you anymore. So it's just such a messy situation, in that this has nothing to do with learning. This has nothing to do with supporting students at all. Proctoring is about catching whether or not students are cheating. And for me as an educator, that's not why I'm in this space. I'm not here to catch whether or not a student is cheating on an exam. I'm here to design assessments that give students multiple ways to be able to show that they have gained the knowledge that I'm hoping that my class and my environment provides.
I'd like to jump in to expand on this. Electronic Freedom Foundation, by the way, I think has taken on Eric Johnson's case, if I'm correct, and they're going to be helping to defend him. Broadening this out beyond just test proctoring and assessment, the LMS has become a surveillance tool as well. And there was a great article just came out in The Nation specifically about Canvas, and all the data that's being collected about students and about faculty in Canvas, things like the Turnitin integration with Canvas, and the fact that all the things your students write and submit through the Canvas Dropbox is helping to feed the Turnitin surveillance project, and that is absolutely a surveillance project. These are pervasive issues in education now, and they've really snuck up on us, right? Because, you know, for years, the LMS was just this kind of clunky administrative convenience, this thing that had your student roster in it, and there's a grade book, and yeah, if you need to give quizzes online because you're not in the classroom or whatever, go ahead and do that. And here's a discussion board that looks just like a discussion board from the 90s. Don't worry, it's 2021, your students won't know the difference. It's a terrible piece of software for teaching and learning just as it is. But now that it's become part of this surveillance project, it's truly dangerous, you know, and I feel so badly as a teacher that I didn't realize when we crossed that line from clunky and wasteful in terms of money and time and attention into real danger. But we have. And I know that's hard to hear, right? Because you're sitting there thinking, but my school requires me to use the LMS, and many schools do require you to use the LMS. And something that I think faculty need to know is that faculty are also being surveilled with the LMS. I actually had an administrator at my school mention to me in passing about someone, she didn't say who it was, but she said, well, we can tell who's doing a good job teaching online or not. We just look at how much time they spend in Canvas, and this person, she only spent X hours, whatever, in Canvas. You know, so the same kind of overreaching, meaningless data that's being collected about student behavior in Canvas is also being collected about faculty behavior. And there are some institutions that have used that. For example, against graduate student instructors going on strike. It is a surveillance tool. And one thing, last thing I'll say about that real quickly is about that question of why that Maya brought up, why and how. You know, they collect all this data in the LMS, but it's not really a good description of what students are learning or why they're not learning or how. And if you look at this article that just came out in The Nation, there's a student who was accused of cheating because of surveillance data collected in the Canvas LMS having to do with the way his browser supposedly was pinging another source on and on. It's a, you know, that lockdown browser kind of thing. But there's all kinds of automatic pings that happen on people's phones and on their computers all the time. You know, just a ping to a server doesn't mean a student has actually done anything wrong. But those clicks, those pings, the movements of your eyeballs, these are all things that are somehow being used against people in a way that I think if you could sort of pull yourself back instantly and just sort of walk into this not having any prior assumptions, you would say, this is absurd. How did all these smart people get trapped in this situation? It's oppressive, it's burdensome trying to think our way through it, but it is a huge issue, I think, especially not just with the proctoring, but with the LMS also.
Thank you. I'm just going to chime in quickly with a couple of related points, just still reverberating with everything that Tutaleni and Laura just said. But I think there's a couple of lenses over here. It's been an interesting role to be in leading teaching and learning efforts at an institution leading up to and during the pandemic, because I think one word that I'd love to unpack, which I think is wound up in all of this, is a word called rigor. Because when I hear this word, you know, for me, half of the time people really mean mistrust, half of the time they really mean fear. But you know, so they're really operationalizing rigor as sort of rigor mortis. It's the death of student engagement, the death of student trust, right? It's quite abysmal. And if there's one sort of bumper sticker I wanted to print over the last year, it's this. It's surveillance technology does not fix poor pedagogy at all. And I'm very grateful that faculty at my institution have been very actively engaged in this conversation. They get cold call emails from proctoring companies, believe it or not just administrators, about, hey, you know, would you be interested in trying this? And they've been pushing back, of course. But I do think that you know, the point that was made earlier about the systems that I think, Jasmine, you were talking about this, the workload of faculty, how they're perceiving what they need to do, and the sort of notion of convenience taking precedence over students' well-being is really one of these persistent forces that are driving people in this direction. So when I think about the cost, you know, at my institution, we had this conversation explicitly at the Senate Standing Committee on Teaching and Learning. We talked about, you know, the ethics of recording students' bodies, the gathering of various kinds of personal information. And when you talk about SLAP suits, Tutaleni, British Columbia is a province that has fairly good legislation when it comes to handling SLAPs, and we're still dealing with this over here. But BC is also a place where we have some of the most stringent privacy legislations in all of Canada, and we're still seeing you know, organizations go ahead with software like this, and sometimes they use waivers that they'll ask students to sign off on. But it's curious to me because it's almost like, you know, this is a waiver in terms of data storage, but they're treating it like it's an ethical waiver in terms of our professional ethics in some ways. And this is deeply concerning to me. And I mean, we apply to research ethics boards for review before we collect data in a research study, but there's no level of this kind of ethical interrogation when we're essentially coercing our students to leave this kind of a digital footprint on these edtech platforms in order to complete their coursework. So for me, you know, there's a number of things. There's information security people usually look at, privacy in a limited sense. But what we've been trying to talk about is we need to consider the ethical and the pedagogical dimensions of any edtech before we ever adopt it. I think a couple of other things maybe quickly. When I've been thinking about, you know, we didn't, but if we had gone with remote proctoring, or as UBC did, I think about what's the cost been. And yes, in the US, they've been diverting funds that could have been used better from the CARES Act. There's the cost of the contract. There's the cost right when the pandemic was hitting, which means when employment options were shrinking and the cost of technology was rising, the cost of students to buy webcams and all of this other unnecessary nonsense. There was also the cost of integration, troubleshooting, support, and then there's the opportunity cost of all of the time we could have spent doing the work with faculty, developing competency around authentic assessments in a way that really would position us better in terms of a future, post-pandemic future. So for me, all of these are really critical things, and I'm grateful that my institution has been having this conversation explicitly. Of course, there are some faculty who are still very interested in this, and we see that even in terms of the comfort level, sort of the content dissemination, people are very comfortable now doing online and learning activities to a slightly lesser degree. But I would say assessments have been the sort of third piece that's really been lagging behind. And there's been a real reticence to give up that sense of control and mistrust. So I think I'll just finish with just noting that, we talk about proctoring, but I think we do have to think about the long-term implications for what is the foundation we're building for the post-pandemic future in terms of pedagogy. Where do we want to go with this? People are talking about the new normal. Is the new normal meant to be surveillance in higher education? And if we're doing so, I think that's really gambling with students' well-being when we're enabling this kind of proctoring.
A really important term that I learned from learning about privacy issues is the idea of purpose limitation. And if people, just want to Google that, you'll see how that shows up in different kinds of privacy policies, not as strongly in the United States as in Europe. But purpose limitation is really the only way we can fight back against machine learning initiatives in education. The desire of tech companies and also of schools to have auto graders, to have auto tutors, to appeal to this idea that we can somehow automate all kinds of parts of education. They're building tools like this right now, turn it on, turn it in, bought Lightside Labs in order to construct a kind of auto tutoring service. Chegg currently has all kinds of auto writing correction and auto writing services that they're selling directly to students. By the way, that's not even marketing to universities. Chegg is trying to sell its services to students. For those systems to work, they need human input, right? They need to see the feedback that we give students on their work, and the LMS is a site for that. Turn it in is a site for that. If you're giving feedback to students, if there's not purpose limitation in place, your work as a teacher becomes part of the creation of these auto tools. And it's it's a scary thing, and it's an important thing to think about for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to cut in really quickly because I think Enrique has a very compelling, very interesting angle on this that I hear come up quite often. And so I want to turn things over to him to kind of frame that up for us.
Hi. Yes, thank you very much. The comment I made earlier, maybe I can just give you the context at my university is that when we moved online, especially with this remote teaching, we are obviously an institution that has been primarily teaching through face-to-face mode. And the sort of monitoring mechanisms that have been done offline, where the idea or the goal was almost to translate that online. And we have accreditation bodies that are monitoring how the quality of teaching has continued to be of expected quality, so to speak, when the institution went online. And one of the things that they look for is whether students are being monitored when they are writing these exams. And because we have these challenges of access to technology, students are then writing exams from wherever they may be using devices that they have. It's really related to the comment made earlier about institutions feeling like they are losing control because students are not on campus. So they need some sort of means to feel in control, and proctoring is one of those. So I have an institution that is actually actively looking for proctoring, and one of the reasons or motivations for that is not necessarily for them to monitor whether students are legitimately being involved in their own assessment, but it's almost part of the requirement of the accreditation bodies. Like they need to prove to the accreditors that when you are awarding this qualification to a student who has gone through a program that they have done online during this period, that can you really prove to us that this is the student who was indeed writing the exams? So we also have that structural way of thinking that is so based on that particular premise that is also informing these approaches in the institutions. And I also have to mention that institutions like mine in a developing country context, they kind of like buy into the promise being made by technology companies without really critically questioning the ethics behind what the companies are doing. For example, because higher education in the developed world is so into AI and other sort of techie terms, everybody wants to go into the route or the bandwagon of AI. So when one hears then a company like proctoring, for example, which promises to enhance the institution's AI development or movement, they jump onto it, but there's little discussion about the ethics, about the rights of the students and the issues of surveillance and so on. So this is really some of the challenges that we are facing because of the context in which we are. So that's basically the idea that I wanted to say through the chat.
Thank you for that, Enrique. I really appreciate that. And I think it's really important to state that we're not just fighting a technology company or set of companies here, right? It's a set of ideas. And it's an idea of pedagogy or cop shit, right? And I'm gonna end, I don't want to be a cop, I want to be an educator. So I also think about blog posts that Sarah wrote about harm reduction around technology and trying to do anything that you can. If I'm not wrong, Georgia didn't, when UBC came out and said, we're going to discourage proctoring for everything except for the accreditors, so you do what you can. Is that right?
Yeah, that is totally correct. Like we made the specific compromise that like in order to get instructors on the Senate to kind of be to agree that there needs to be, you know, these stipulations for accreditation bodies, but we still need to challenge these accreditation bodies that they're including these like remote proctoring softwares that are violating a lot of our commitments towards like equity, diversity, and inclusion as an institution. You know, a lot of these institutions have also been like looking for alternate remote proctoring softwares that are, you know, less racist or less suing people that are criticizing them. And you know, it's really just like the question has become like, oh, what's the lesser evil in remote proctoring software? What is an acceptable level of surveillance? Which kind of goes to the point around which kind of goes to the point of like, you know, even in-person exam invigilation, you know, at least they're not, you know, examining your eyes up close and seeing if you're darting your eyes around and being suspicious. But, you know, it still is very much surveillance. And I see that kind of as the wrong emphasis. You know, and it's like the emphasis should be on what are we actually teaching people? What are we actually learning as well? And, you know, I kind of see that that difference between like surveillance versus what we're actually learning in such contrast to, you know, all of these institutions that are making commitments towards anti-racism and equity and all of that, while they're still like, oh, we're going to keep racist and ableist, you know, remote proctoring software. But I think there's also a point to be made that I think Sarah brought up earlier around, you know, open access, you know, in the real world, as a lot of students kind of call it, or like if they're when they're in the workforce or if they go on to be academics or scholars, they're not, you're not going to be in a work situation where you won't have access to, you know, Google, you won't have the access to your colleagues who you can rely on for advice. And so the emphasis really should be on, you know, what are we actually learning? You know, you're really not going to be in a work situation where you're a doctor or an engineer or an academic where somebody is like holding your actions under a microscope.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. Something in going back to like, you know, the like what virtually connecting used to be and what it is in true virtually connecting session. We are out of time. We're at the top of the hour. But I do want to invite anybody who wants to leave to leave. We didn't really get a chance to talk about the conference. We can go a little bit longer. I can go a little bit longer. I think Meha has a couple of minutes, but if people need to leave now, I want to open that door up and let you know that you can drop out if you need to, but I'd love to stick around and talk a little bit more maybe about the conference or some overlaps between the conference and this particular topic. For me, going back to something that Meha said earlier, a big overlap between the conference and this particular topic is the fact that there isn't a sponsor, there isn't a remote proctoring sponsor on this conference. And I had an experience last year with Meha, as well as Michelle Pacansky-Brock and Melody Buckner. Melody, yes. And so where we were invited to give a session, and then like a day before the session, we found out that a proctoring company was going to be sponsoring our session. And it just felt, I would never expect that from this conference. This conference is not the kind of conference that I would ever expect that from. And so I love that about OER, the OER and domains conferences. But it's really interesting to me, the sponsorships that we're asked to give, what we're asked to lend our name and our expertise to, and how we're represented by these different institutions.
I'll chime in with something about the conference real quick because I probably should go. I've got a heap of student stuff to read and respond to. But one of the cool things that I just loved about the way they did this whole online conference was the combination of sync stuff and async stuff. And the reason I want to bring that up here in particular is that the videos were made instantly available after the talks for people to view, and not just people with a conference logon, but they were in the open. And I just want to point out they were unlisted videos, people, just like the ones that Ian was sharing. I was sharing unlisted video links nonstop for the past 72 hours because that's exactly how the YouTube system is set up. It allows you to have this explosion of videos in your account. So this was the alt account, I think, was running the YouTube stream. And so if you went to the alt account page at YouTube, you couldn't find the videos, but all you had to do was go to Twitter or look at someone's blog post, or you could embed it. I embedded my unlisted video in a web page and published it. So I just want to say that the technology of unlisted videos is great. It can be used for the good. And that's what the organizers at this great conference did. They set that up so it all worked really seamlessly. And I'm going to enjoy the weekend catching up on all the things I missed, because being sync nonstop on British time for 2 days, that was beyond me, but I'm going to catch up this weekend. So that's the last thing I wanted to say. And thanks everybody for this event. It was really good to see you all again. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
It's great
Laura.
to see you, Laura. I will say, just to the point that Laura was just making, and this is, unsolicited free advice for edtech vendors of all stripes over here, that it might be a good idea if you want to convince people that you know what you're doing when it comes to handling very sensitive student data, that you understand the difference between a private and an unlisted video. Just saying. The other thing I'm going to suggest is, if you want to convince universities to work with you, you might not want to worry them about the potential of when a stray faculty member receives an onboarding video, if they accidentally share it on social media, that suddenly they're worried about being sued by your company. This is unsolicited free advice. I do think it is sensible, though.
Obscurity is not security, right? It's like the #1 sort of aphorism, and apparently also the basis of a significant lawsuit. There is a really good discussion going on in the YouTube chat about the connection between this kind of surveillance technology in the classroom and policing, right? How, are you a campus that's willing to have a conversation about abolishing proctoring? Okay, well, what's your view about abolishing your campus police, right? Like, how do those conversations intersect, and how can we maybe build this into a larger conversation about the way our campuses behave as social spaces? And then also, coming back to, I think Rajiv made this point earlier, but like the way faculty are preyed upon by many of these tools, and it's not just the proctoring ones, right? Top Hat is great for sending little sneaky emails to your faculty and asking them if they want to get on board, right? And so the ways in which they're pitching themselves as time saving, labor saving, speaking directly to a university kind of economy of austerity and scarcity. So 2 thoughts that are emerging on the chat that I thought I'd bring to the group.
I think the other thing that connects to this is, I think we've mentioned a few times before about the appeal of these things is because they make the job of teaching easy, which I'm not so sure about that, but at least they eliminate some tasks because the job is much more than that. But I think it links to a larger issue about just the very nature of labor in the academy. Right. The reason why I would rather do a multiple choice question on Canvas that automatically scores is not just because I'm lazy, might be on some days, but it could be because I probably have tons of other stuff that has been piled on my plate. I've always said that in education, and I can't complain being at the university, this might even be much more so at a K-12. In education, we tend to put more and more onto the shoulders of teachers, especially. But I have a hard time remembering what we have taken off, right? There's always more and more that we're piling on. They have to keep doing more. And, we haven't figured out how to extend that 24-hour-a-day clock yet. So there's always all of these things. So I think part of the reason, I think this has to be more of a systems approach and saying, okay, what are the other things that are in this ecosystem that really needs to be addressed to say, well, maybe, and I don't know what the answer to it is that I think we need to really have a broader conversation around this. For me, it became much more evident, especially around the pandemic, in that I think in education, we were a lot more concerned about the students functioning in this space, which is what we're supposed to do. But I don't think we paid as much attention to faculty and staff who were also making this learning possible, right? A lot of schools say that, okay, now you're gonna have to go online and be able to teach us a class synchronously, asynchronously, and in almost multiple ways. So we turn one class often to 3 different versions, but really didn't give the faculty and staff any other resources. So I think we just also need at the same time to exercise some sort of care with faculty and staff and students. And then maybe in doing that, we might be able to invalidate and make some of these tools that are supposed to make the job easy unnecessary. I know that's dreamy in my world, but I think that could definitely be a space where we need to spend more time also.
One other thing I've been thinking a lot about is, nearly every college and university will want to plaster on their front page that we are student-centered, we're committed to student success, right? When you tell instructors, we want you to use a proctoring system, part of what you're saying is, yeah, we want to cut out the part where you read your student work, give students feedback. Whenever, I'm talking to an instructor that says, I wish I could just cut out the work of having to grade exams, for example. It really feels like the message we're sending to our instructors is we don't care about that part that you give your students. We'll buy a technology to cut it out as soon as we can. And it's been very powerful for me to kind of help some instructors reorient about that. At Dearborn, which say, yeah, we don't have anything to watch your students. We don't have that much to automatically grade your students' work, and I know that this is a labor intensive part, but it's the part that we care most about. If there's something else that's gonna fall out of the mix because of that, that's okay. If you don't have perfectly produced videos, if your Canvas page is a little bit disorganized, we can help you with that too. We can work on it, but what we really want is your connection with the students. And we're choosing not to invest in something to put a barrier between that. And yeah, this is hopefully what the students are coming for, is to connect with instructors, get feedback directly from them. So yeah, that's, I think, another important message that we send when we reject proctoring software is that we're prioritizing the unmediated connection and relationship between instructors and students.
I love that. I think that's so important. And I think it does send that message. We are already over time. So I think maybe this is a good point to wrap everything up because we're over time and such. So I want to thank everybody for watching. I want to thank everybody who came, and I will just let everybody know that Ian does have a GoFundMe. I know that Brenna put it into the chat there. It's gofundme.com/f/stand-against-proctorio. If you can, please go and give a couple dollars to that and try to help out there. And thank you, everyone.
I'm just going to put the
Thank you so
GoFundMe
much.
on the screen so that people who are watching later can see it. Because otherwise it's not going to show up. Thank you
What are you
everyone
gonna put
for
on
joining us. I'm just going to put the GoFundMe page up on the screen.
Yes. Oh, that's a great idea. Yes, please.
Yeah. I don't
That
know
is
how
what you're looking for.
short link, but yeah. All right. Thank you everyone for joining us. I am going to hopefully stop the live stream.